where might we learn how not to be, women, like the what's his name, Swearingen's women in the brothels on Swearingen's, or the women on OnlyFans, or the kinds of mistakes that we make. I mean, in the hookup culture that pretty much I think every grown woman now has probably had some adventures. I was in college in the 80s. Yes, we were like young then too. That you have made mistakes in your relationships with each other over and over and over again. Where might we learn how to behave better? So what's fun about this is some of those pictures I've been showing you of women in their finery and stuff like that were painted by the same person who painted this image of, well, Mary Magdalene when she's all fancied, right? And she's fancied up just as Swearingen's women would have been for the same reason.
Oh, this is the garden.
No, this is the portrait of Mary Magdalene, and she's dressed in. So these are Jacques Joseph Tissot's biblical pictures. He's Roman Catholic and French, but apparently much beloved in Victorian England, which was a bit of an achievement, because when he was doing all of these pictures, now I'm showing the woman taken in adultery image. He went to Palestine, which was still Palestine at this point, no Israel, because not 1948 yet. And he took photographs and did a lot of research so that he was considered to be showing the historically accurate scenes in which Jesus lived, right? And it's sort of complicated because there's yet more layers of mythologizing in the representations here, but this is meant to be the historically accurate representations of what Jesus's life was actually like in this. I don't know, it's not really orientalizing, but it is sort of, in the sense that the Europeans by this point are, one, very powerful militarily and commercially, and two, have a particular vision of the East as backward and maybe a bit barbaric, talking about civilizing still. And yet their images of how to behave well are set there. Yeah.
So they're admitting the origin of the culture's ideal.
Interestingly, in the Middle Ages, they were always very clear about it, and they put Jerusalem on their maps at the center of the world. I mean, this is, for me, the irony of everyone. It's like when I was at 3 Cheers for White Men, and it's like, how to prove you're not a white supremacist. And I'm like, well, I kind of study devotion to Jesus and Mary. And they're perfectly clear throughout the Middle Ages that, well, okay, so here we have now Salome and her dancing, right? Which is Tissot's, he gives her a handstand. She's doing yoga by this way. She's actually doing a pretty good handstand.
Where she's going, she's bent over, provocatively.
And Herod's leaning over his cushions at her. That European culture was always very, I mean, there is no medieval culture without the Bible, quite bluntly. And they're imagining themselves as kings, right? These 10th century kings are imagining themselves through the Psalms. So they're imagining themselves into this Jerusalem story, into this ancient world story, even as they're trying to figure out how to be king of England, setting up their little castles and burrs and cities and such. It's so interesting. And this is where you knew what the pictures were, so you were rightly pointing our audience to this, that the stories of chivalry that we're working with, I said white men, but they were never actually fundamentally European.
I don't know why that is perpetuated. It's just, like I've mentioned this so many times on my channel, Europa was a Phoenician goddess, a Semitic.
Right.
Even the name for Europe is Semitic. It's like, I just don't understand this very strange kind of Chinese whispers of saying Europe and thinking white and thinking non-Middle Eastern. you know, and not thinking of the cauldron of the Semitic civilizations, because they were cauldrons, they were ethnic cauldrons. It just blows my mind that it's the synthetic homogeneity is transposed onto the history of the whole Mediterranean. I just don't understand why, except for a discomfort in dealing with the non-European Christianity. Maybe there's something in that. People don't really want to deal with it, maybe because it wrecks the Marxists' angle that Christians are evil white colonizers and they've wrecked non-white societies by bringing Christianity in.
Something like that, yeah. It's like
it's the only explanation I can think for it.
We're going to have to think about this and unpack it, because it's very... I mean, the more it's like, I like studying history. Right now I'm reading this book where I was reading about Tissot's paintings, these paintings, and in this British Victorian attempt to give the historical Jesus, the actual accurate historical Jesus, and realizing this is a new book, and so I couldn't have known this quite in the way that she told it because she just wrote the book, but that no matter how many times I unpeel layers in this story, as we've been discovering with our arc streams, and you find yet another layer in it, that there is this, where is the colonial, where is the white, where is the chivalric, where is the, well, you might have to, and this is the one that you liked a lot, the garden. Sit at his feet. This one's by a Polish artist, right? Whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, but this is one of my absolute favorite paintings, because of course Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha with much labor is saying, why isn't she helping me with the housework? And Jesus saying to Mary, to Martha, that Mary has chosen the better part. She's learning the wisdom from me, which it's chivalry. Are you kidding me? Where are you going to have the idea that this culture that came from this story didn't dignify women? That was another one. I was just like, it does, feminists, where do you think your sense of we get an education too? We get to sit at the feet of our Lord, listening to his teaching, just as the Gospels say Mary did, and that there's this premise that somehow this, whatever tradition it is, and it's like we don't even know what to label it. Christian is good, right? Remember when you were learning how to blow your nose properly, it was Christian behavior. They were in the 18th century specifically labeling it a Christian. But what does Christian behavior mean? Who's Christian? Not even who's Christianity. What does Christian behavior mean? And the numbers of times I felt like we're in these odd internet Minecraft conversations about, you're not being Christian. And I'm like, how much are you living that story?
Yeah, well, I've been ranting a lot because the constant rant, but I'm wrestling with this meme of cat ladies and eggless eagles. It's never sat well with me, and that's not because I've ever tried to misrepresent myself as pious and virtuous, because I wasn't. And I'm not bothered by people calling me eggless or a cat lady.
I would be bothered by being called a cat lady. Dog, please. Dog lady.
Oh yeah. Well, no, it was a strange thing. It was like, okay, we're in a digital world that seems to have returned to pre-Christian honor culture feeling of stoning the whores. Let's stone the whores. And I found it very odd when Christ refused to do it. He refused to do it. And I've said it many times, that there is no... I don't feel like our virtue as women is going to be restored by this like digital stoning. I just don't think it will be. And if it was, then Christ would have stoned the adulteress, but he didn't. So if we approach the establishment of a digital culture on the foundation of what Christ did, he establishes the pattern. He's the axiom of civilization. He's the Logos. The Logos established the teaching for the physical world, in that he said, he who is without sin cast the first stone. He refused to stone the adulteress, and yet strangely we go onto the internet and it's the Christians, and specifically the Christian men, who are probably the worst I've ever seen in terms of their treatment of women that have fallen in virtue, with very little discussion on why women ended up like that in the first place. Why are women in frontier cultures operating like the women in frontier cultures in the Wild West? Because there's a historian, I've got the book here, and there's a whole chapter on prostitution in North America. It was a fascinating read. And according to this historian, he's a commie, but he did good work. And he said that at one point, in particular regions of North America, in frontier times, you could barely find a woman that hadn't done sex work at one stage just to survive.
Right.
So when you're in an environment where the patriarchy's collapsed, I'm not advocating sex work. I'm just, it's not me making excuses for sin or for a lack of virtue, but it's like I'm being realistic about the treatment of what's happening here. The denial of frontier conditions. I think a lot of people are in denial about the frontier conditions that we're in. So I say, okay, we're in frontier conditions. What does that mean? There's no patriarchy. If you're lucky, you'll get a Swearingen.
Right.
If you're lucky, you'll get an Al Swearingen who's running a saloon, who has a lot of guns and a lot of really, loyal people around that will enforce protection of the women in that environment. But beyond having an Al Swearingen or a Timothy Oliphant, who marries his brother's widow, the frontier itself does not allow for mercy of unprotected females. So it's like this kind of environment is what's happening in the digital world. So we end up with, instead of whores in saloons, women are all over the internet having OnlyFans accounts.
Right.
And obviously it's not just a survival issue. There's a lot more going on there. My problem with the behavior of the Christian men on the internet is that, okay, you want to bring Christianity to the world, but Christ wouldn't stone that adulteress. He didn't stone the whore. So why are we doing it on the internet? There's a disconnect, to me, there's a disconnect between the two things. Or saying, oh, this woman's eggless, or this woman's a cat lady. The other day I said, I'm done with the trope. I don't want to deal with the term cat lady anymore. There are women that exist in this culture that should have been nuns, that had no idea it was a vocation that was possible for them. Women are not raised to consider these things. If you're lucky, you grow up in a cradle Catholic environment where you even know that monasteries exist. But if you don't, how do you renounce the creation of a family without going into a feminist environment? Where's your out? So I don't think everybody's really analyzing exactly what it means to be in frontier conditions. And
we have a super chat. So Isaiah and Annie Z, chivalry arrives with civilization, yoking masculinity. Globalism wants to kill masculinity, so we've explored this a lot. When maybe you have to figure out where to put a lot of these things that we've learned tonight. That the colonialism, the frontier stuff. It's like if we end up with the Tower of Babel version of things, we're also in trouble. The real question seemed to be nobody was wanting to think about where the ideals I was describing were coming from. When Mary Magdalene is in the stories, the first one to see our Lord risen, what does she do? This is one of my favorite of Tissot's images, right? She's just, and to think that she was the one that he does the painting of her in her full regalia, right? Now she is flat at the foot of our Lord. And then that is our risen Lord. The problem of, I think we're dealing with a lot in the internet context of what relation should men have to Christ? What relation do women have to Christ? And it's all, all of our relationships with each other in Christian understanding mediated through him. The thing that the women in the Gospels know is on the one hand, they belong at his feet, learning from him, and two, they belong at his feet.